The wind was not a comfort. It was a tool. It scraped the high plains of the New Mexico Territory flat, and it threw the skin of the earth into May Calloway's eyes. She blinked. The grit was instant, tasting of salt and distance. She did not wipe it away. Wiping just smeared the dust into mud. This was the year 1878. The streams had forgotten the sound of their own running. The sky was a hard, pale blue, like a ceramic plate held too close to a fire. It promised nothing. The sun was not a giver of life. It was a judgment. It beat down on the warped shingles of her small ranch house. It baked the ground into cracked tiles. May stood at the lip of the well. Her hands knew the winch. The wood was smooth, polished by her own sweat and the endless, repetitive motion of her worry. Below, in the dark, the water waited. It was low. It was always low now. She lowered the oak bucket, her shoulders taking the familiar strain. She listened. The faint splash that came back sounded hollow, far away. It was the sound of something ending. Survival in this territory meant counting. May counted bullets when she cleaned her rifle. She counted cans of beans in the pantry. Most of all, she counted the inches of water in the well. But lately, May Calloway found herself counting other things. She counted the compromises she had not yet made. She counted the silences in town, the way folks in Redemption looked past her, or through her. She wanted to keep this land. Her husband, Amos, had put his bones and his belief into this dry soil. And the soil, in its casual way, had taken him a cattle accident. They told her, a vague accident. May learned quickly that vagueness was a weapon. It was a tool men used against a woman who owned a working well when their own creeks were just beds of hot stones. After Amos, she had learned the rifle. It was not a natural fit. It was a heavy, awkward piece of steel and wood. She learned to break it down, clean the barrel, oil the mechanism. She learned the solid kick against her shoulder, the sharp smell of the powder. The rifle was a paradox. It was a tool for protection. It was a tool for destruction. She held that contradiction in her hands every evening, her fingers tracing the cold metal. She wanted to keep the land. That was the first thing. But she also wanted to keep her conscience. It was getting harder, much harder, to hold both. The town was named Redemption. The name was a bitter joke, spat into the dust. Redemption was dry of water and drier of kindness. In the town's only saloon, Red Tucker sold fear. He sold it by the glass, and men bought it eagerly. He was a large man who filled doorways. His voice was sandpaper, loud with stories of the Comanche. He talked about smoke on the horizon, about the savagery of the raids. He pointed fingers. He made lists of who was safe and who was not. Red Tucker did not want justice. Justice was complicated. Tucker wanted power. He wanted men to look at him with that shallow, quick fear that passed for respect in a thirsty land. Silas Cobb wanted something simpler, something tangible. He wanted the Calloway Ranch. Or rather, he wanted the Calloway Well. Water was the only real currency. Silas owned the sprawling, neighboring property, but his creek was nothing but baked mud and bleached stones. He approached May every month. He offered to buy her out. His offers were always, he said, reasonable. He smiled when he said it, a dry, thin smile that showed too many teeth. Silas wanted the land. He wanted the water. He was a patient man. He believed the drought, or Red Tucker, would eventually give it to him. And the law. The law was Deputy Hart. Hart was a young man, barely older than the century, trying to find a straight path in a canyon full of switchbacks. He wore his badge polished. He read his paper laws from a book, but Red Tucker's shadow was long. It fell over the badge. It fell over the book. Hart was caught. He was trapped between the ink on the paper and the steel of Tucker's gun. He was looking for the right thing to do in a place where the right thing was often hidden in the darkest alley. May finished pulling the bucket up. The rope fibers bit into her palms. The water sloshed. It was precious. It was grace in a bucket. She carried it, conserving every step, to the small cellar built into the side of a dirt mound. The cellar door was thick, angled against the pervasive dust. It was the only cool, safe place on the ranch. It was the line between inside and outside, between what was hers and what the world wanted to take. She stored her jars of preserves there, her sacks of flour, her emergency barrels of water. That door was her final boundary. The world was dividing itself into clean, sharp pieces. There was us, and there was them. The talk in town was always about them. The Comanche, Maka Greyhawk, their leader, was a name spoken like a curse in the saloon. But May had heard other stories, whispers from travelers, from the quiet sister Leonie who ran the small infirmary. They said Maka Greyhawk did not break treaties. They said he kept his own law, a hard law, but one built on honor. Koa Blackbird was another name, younger, a warrior. His reasons were simpler than any politician's. He wanted to survive. He wanted to keep his dignity in a world that wanted to strip it from him, piece by piece. These three forces were pulling the territory tight, like a rawhide strip left in the sun. The posse, funded by Fear and Silas Cobb's money, led by Red Tucker, the Comanche, searching for their own survival. Led by Maka Greyhawk, the town, represented by Deputy Hart, strangled by the drought and its own prejudices. May Calloway stood in the middle of that pull. She did not know it yet. She only knew her well was low and her rifle was clean. A single choice, that is all it would take. A single decision, born of impulse or conscience, to save one life. That decision would shatter the drought's quiet monotony. It would pull all three of those worlds down onto this small, dry patch of ground. It would force a reckoning, not in the town square, but right here, at her ranch. She finished her chores as the sun began to bleed out. It stained the high mesas purple and orange. The air grew thin. Sometimes, in the shimmer of the late-day heat, she saw things, a vision, a waking dream. She saw horsemen. They were shadows against the glare. They were riding in a wide, slow circle around a single point. They were a living fence. In the center of that circle stood a woman. The woman's back was straight. She held a rifle, not aimed, but held ready. Her hand was steady on the dark wood. She was the only thing holding the circle apart. She was the boundary, the line between life and death. May shook her head hard. The vision dissolved. It was just dust. It was just the heat playing tricks. This land demanded everything. It demanded your sweat and your hope. It ground them down into a fine powder. You had to find a way to laugh. A dry, cracked laugh. Or you turned to stone. May walked to the empty trough. She looked at her thin cattle. Their ribs showed like wicker baskets under their hides. She muttered to the nearest bony cow, a brindle with one horn. "In this place," she told the cow, "whiskey does not cure thirst. Water is the only baptism." The cow just chewed, slow and patient, its eyes half closed. It understood waiting. Tired, May turned back to the house. The narrative was set. It was heroic, because staying human here was an act of daily war. It was sad, because so many gave up the fight. The story would build slow. This was the inhalation. The compression would come, then the explosion. But it would all turn on that one pivot, saving one life. A life that was, at this moment, moving closer. In the distance, a small curl of dust rose, unseen. It was not the wind. The sun dipped. The first stars appeared, cold and sharp as nailheads. Somewhere, far off, a coyote cried. The sound was thin and hungry. May barred her door. She did not yet know that the true boundary, the one that mattered, was not the door to her house, but the heavy oaken door to her cellar, the line between trust and suspicion. She checked the rifle one last time. It leaned against the wall, a silent promise. Protection, destruction. The air cooled. The long drought held the land in its fist. But change was coming. It was riding hard, and it was bleeding. The end of the story was already waiting. It waited in a drop of rain. It waited on a piece of bone tied with sinew. It waited for the circle of grace to close. The sun was not yet a threat, but a promise. It cracked the horizon, spilling a thin gray light across the New Mexico territory. May Calloway was already moving. The cold air was sharp in her lungs. It was the only time of day the land offered any relief, before the real heat began, before the world turned to brass and baked clay. Her first chore was always the same. It was a ritual. It was a prayer. The well. She walked from the small, solid ranch house, her boots scuffing the packed dirt. The silence was vast, broken only by the groan of the barn door shifting in the morning breeze. A hinge was crying out for grease. Grease was a luxury. Everything was a luxury when water was not a right, but a gamble. She reached the winch. Her hands, calloused and capable, knew the feel of the rope. It was stiff, abrasive. She lowered the bucket into the darkness. She did not count the seconds. She listened. The sound that came back up was not a hearty splash. It was a hollow thwack, followed by a weak slosh. The water was lower. She pulled, hand over hand. The weight of the full bucket was a comfort. It was real. When it surfaced, she measured the dampness on the rope, marking it against a small notch she had carved into the well's wooden lip. A fraction of an inch. She had lost another fraction of an inch to the dry, thirsty earth. This well was the hourglass of her survival. It measured not just time, but the dwindling reserves of decency in the territory. Every bucket she drew was a statement. It was a piece of her conscience, pulled up from the dark. She carried the water, one bucket for the house, one for the cattle. The muscles in her shoulders and back were tight, familiar with the load. Her cattle, thin as stray dogs, watched her from their dusty pen. Their ribs were stark, like the frames of abandoned baskets. They did not moo. They saved their energy. They just watched, their large brown eyes dull and trusting. Their patience was an accusation. This ranch had cost her everything. It had cost her Amos. Amos had been dead for 2 years. He was a quiet man, with a belief in this land that May had found foolish, and then, later, had found herself inheriting. His death was a blur, a cattle incident. They called it a stampede, miles from the ranch. It was vague. Red Tucker and 2 of his men had been the ones to find him. They said his horse had stumbled in a gopher hole, that the herd had done the rest. They had brought him home to her, draped over his own saddle. Their faces were properly solemn. A week later, while the dust was still settling on the new grave, Silas Cobb had paid his respects. And then he had made his first offer for the ranch. A fair price, he called it, for a grieving widow. May learned about grief. It had 2 paths. One was water, the tears that softened you until you dissolved. The other was stone. May could not afford to waste water. She had learned the lock on her grief. She learned the lock on her pantry. And she learned the mechanism of her husband's Winchester rifle. She had traded the softness of a wife for the hard utility of a survivor. This change had not gone unnoticed in Redemption. In town, she had a name. They called her the Stone Widow, cold as a well stone. She heard one woman whisper to another by the flour barrels in the general store. Harder than drought-caked mud. A woman alone was supposed to be gentle. She was supposed to be a soft thing, easily frightened, requiring protection. May did not require protection. She met their stares. She did not flutter her hands. She did not lower her eyes. She was not pitiful. She was, to them, an unnatural thing. She was an obstacle to Silas Cobb's desire for her water, an obstacle to Red Tucker's need to control everyone through their fear. She hitched her single horse to the old wagon. She needed salt. She needed flour. The trip to town was a thing she dreaded. The squeak of the wagon wheel was loud in the morning air, a sharp, repetitive complaint. Redemption was a collection of gray, unpainted buildings huddled together as if for warmth. But there was no warmth here. There was just dust and suspicion. As she neptered the center of town, the bat-wing doors of the saloon swung open. A man stumbled out, but not before the noise from within spilled onto the street. A tinny piano, a loud, false laugh, and over it all, Red Tucker's voice. He was holding court. Not a man left. He boomed. The whole outpost burned to the ground. That is what the Comanche do. They are not human, friends. They are a pestilence. May kept her eyes forward. Tucker was selling his favorite product. He was selling fear. He packaged it in stories of smoke and savagery. He made the men in that dark room feel that their fear was justified, that it was righteous, and that he, Red Tucker, was the only man strong enough to protect them. His power was built on their terror. She saw Silas Cobb further down the boardwalk. He was not in the saloon. He was a different kind of predator. He was talking quietly to a man May recognized, Mr. Henderson, whose small creek had finally turned to dust last month. Silas had his hand on Henderson's shoulder, his face a mask of deep, neighborly concern. He was nodding. He was listening. And then, May knew. He would make his offer. A fair price. He was a patient buzzard, content to let the drought and Tucker do the hard work. He just waited to claim the carcass. Then she saw the law, Deputy Hart. Hart was standing outside his small office, the tin star on his chest polished bright. He looked young. He looked tired. He saw May and gave a short, stiff nod. His eyes darted from May's wagon to the saloon, where Tucker's voice rose again. He looked at Silas Cobb, who was now shaking Mr. Henderson's hand. Hart was a man caught in a vice. He had his orders from the county, a stack of papers in his desk that told him what the law was. But the law in redemption was not made of paper. It was made of fear, and it was held in Red Tucker's hand. The shadow cast by Tucker's gun was longer and darker than any shadow cast by Hart's law book. Hart was trying to find a straight line in a crooked world. He adjusted his gun belt. He looked at May again, then quickly looked away. He did not want to be involved. He turned and retreated into the dim, safe quiet of his office, where the law was simple and clean and had nothing to do with the world outside his door. May tied the horse to the hitching post. The general store was dim inside, the air thick with the competing smells of coffee, cured tobacco, kerosene, and dried apples. The two other women in the store, the blacksmith's wife and the banker's wife, stopped their quiet talking when May entered. The silence was heavy. It was a judgment. This was the line between us and them. May, the cold woman, the stone widow, was them. She was not part of the circle of gentle, respectable women. She was an outcast by choice, because the price of entry was to be weak, and she would not be weak. She walked to the counter. The proprietor, Mr. Finch, gave her a thin smile. Mrs. Calloway, just salt and flour today. And a box of cartridges for the Winchester, May said, her voice even. The women whispered. The blacksmith's wife pretended to inspect a bolt of calico. A man from the saloon, one of Tucker's followers, pushed into the store. He was flushed with whiskey and self-importance. He saw May. He grinned, a loose, wet grin. Well now, Ms. Calloway, he slurred, leaning on the counter. You look parched. A lady should not look so parched. Let me buy you a whiskey over at the saloon. May turned her head slowly. She looked at him. Her eyes were the color of the sky, pale and empty of heat. I am dry, she said, her voice low. But in this territory, whiskey does not cure thirst. It only borrows from tomorrow. She picked up her sack of flour, heavy on her shoulder. Water, she said, to the man, to the proprietor, to the whispering women, is the only baptism here. The man blinked, his grin faltering. He did not understand. The women looked shocked, as if she had cursed in church. May paid her coin. She did not say another word. She walked out of the store, her back straight, into the blinding, honest glare of the sun. The ride home was long. The wagon wheel complained with every turn. The heat baked her. She thought about the town, the fear, the whispers, the patient hunger of Silas Cobb, the weakness of Deputy Hart. They were all connected. They were all waiting for her to fail, waiting for the well to dry up, waiting for the Comanche to provide the excuse they all needed to wipe her off the map. The air in the territory was so dry, so brittle, that a single spark could set the whole prairie ablaze. A gunshot, an angry word, or a small choice, a single act of humanity in a place that was forgetting what that meant. May did not know it. She could not know it, but that choice was waiting for her. It was not in town. It was out here, in the dust, just over the next rise. She pulled the wagon into the yard. The horse drooped its head, lathered in sweat. She began the slow, methodical work of unhitching. The routine was her anchor. Put the flour in the cellar, store the salt, check the cattle, fix the loose wire on the pen. The world was held together by these small, repeated tasks. But the tension was pulling it apart. The tinder was dry. The air was still. A single decision was all it would take to burn everything down. The day's heat had settled in, a heavy, suffocating blanket. May had finished her morning work. The water she had drawn sat in the relative cool of the house, a treasure hoarded. But the small trough at the far end of the property, the one Amos had built near the boundary line, was dry. The cattle there were too weak to make the long walk back to the barn. She yoked her shoulders with the wooden carrying pole. 2 small buckets of water, a fraction of what they needed, was all she could manage. It was a long, hot walk. The sun was a white hole in the sky. The heat reflected off the baked ground, and she tasted the salt of her own sweat on her upper lip. She was walking along the dry arroyo, a scar in the earth that should have been a stream. When she saw it, it was not a rock. It was not a dead coyote. It was a man. He was sprawled in the dust and cracked mud, almost invisible. He wore leather leggings and no shirt. His skin was the color of the earth he was lying on. Comanche. May stopped. Her first instinct was fear. It was a cold jolt in her stomach. The stories from town, from Red Tucker, filled her mind. Smoke, fire, savagery. Her hand went to the rifle she carried, its strap digging into her shoulder. She waited. He did not move. She took a few steps closer. He was young. His black hair was matted with dust and something dark and wet. He was lying on his side. His breathing was a shallow, desperate rasp. She saw the wound. His thigh. A broken arrow shaft stood out from the dark. Swollen muscle. It was not a Comanche arrow. The fletching was wrong. He was dying. The realization cut through her fear. He was not a warrior. He was not a threat. He was just a man, bleeding out, cooking to death under the white sun. His lips were split and pale with dust. She unhooked one of the water buckets from the yoke. She set it down. She took her tin dipper from her belt. She was moving toward him, her rifle still in her hand, but pointed at the ground. When she heard the other sound, it was not a whisper. It was the pounding of hooves, many hooves, coming fast. May spun around. Over the rise, a cloud of dust boiled up. A moment later, riders crested the hill. Red Tucker was in the lead. He had 6 men with him. The posse. They thundered down the slope and pulled up in a half circle, their horses rearing and blowing. They all had rifles. Tucker saw May. Then he saw the man on the ground. His face, already red from the sun and whiskey, split into a triumphant grin. "Well, look what we have here. Mrs. Calloway," he boomed. "You have found our stray." His men fanned out, their rifles held ready. May stood between the posse and the wounded man. "What do you mean?" she asked. "That," Tucker said, jabbing a thick finger, "is Koa Blackbird. He and his friends murdered the Henderson boy over at the Dry Creek crossing. We have been tracking him all morning." May looked at the man on the ground. He had not moved. Murdered. The word felt heavy, ugly. "He is not a threat to anyone," May said. "He is almost dead." Tucker laughed. A short, barking sound. He is not dead enough. He swung his leg over his saddle and dropped to the ground. He unholstered his pistol. We are here to finish the job. For the good of the folks in Redemption. He cocked the hammer. The sound was loud in the stillness. No, May said. Tucker stopped. He looked at her as if she were a horse that had just spoken. What did you say? Woman. May's heart was pounding, a dry drum against her ribs. She looked at Tucker. She looked at his men. She looked at the man on the ground. His chest barely moved. She made her choice. She kept her rifle in her left hand, its barrel pointing down. She walked back to her bucket. She dipped the tin cup into the precious water. She heard Tucker shout something, but she ignored him. She knelt in the dust beside Koa Blackbird. She saw his eyes flicker open. They were black, deep, and unfocused. She lifted the dipper. Mrs. Calloway, I am telling you, Tucker roared. Get away from that savage. May did not look at Tucker. She looked at the man. She brought the dipper to his cracked lips and tilted it. A small trickle of water, darker than silver, ran over his lip and into his mouth. He swallowed. It was a reflex, a spasm, but it was a swallow. It was an act of defiance. It was an act of grace. May heard the crunch of boots. Red Tucker was right behind her. He grabbed her shoulder. I said, "Get up." May stood. She turned to face him. She was not a tall woman, but she stood straight. She shifted the rifle. She did not raise it to aim. She held it across her body, her hand on the stock, the barrel low. It was a bar. It was a boundary. "This is my land, Mr. Tucker," she said. Her voice did not shake. Tucker's face was purple. He was not used to being defied. His hand tightened on his own pistol. "You will not commit a murder on my land," May said. His men were watching. They were silent, tense. "It ain't murder," one of them spat. "It is justice." "He is wounded," May said. Her eyes locked on Tucker. "He has no weapon. You shoot him like this. It is murder, and you will not do it here." Tucker stared at her. His little eyes were full of hate. He wanted to hit her. He wanted to shoot the man behind her. He wanted to assert his power. His authority was being questioned by a woman, in front of his men. He raised his pistol, pointing it not at May, but at the man on the ground. And he hesitated. He looked around. His eyes scanned the rocks, the high mesas, the vast, empty horizon. The silence of the plains was absolute, too absolute. Tucker was a brute, but he was not a fool. He knew the stories. He knew Make a Greyhawk. One Comanche was never truly alone. If he fired that pistol, the sound would carry for miles. Were there other warriors in those rocks? Was this a trap? Was this young warrior bait? He did not know, and that lack of knowledge was the only thing protecting May. He was afraid. He was afraid of the unseen. He was afraid of what might be watching him, right now. From a distance he could not measure. He slowly, hatefully, lowered the hammer on his pistol. He holstered it. "You are a fool, woman," he snarled. "You are a traitor to your own kind." He spat in the dust, near her feet. "When his friends come, and they will come, they will cut your throat. They will burn your ranch. And I will not lift a finger to help you. I will sit in town and listen to you scream." He turned his back on her. He stomped to his horse and pulled himself into the saddle. "You men," he yelled, "we are leaving. Let the widow have her new pet. Let her see what Comanche gratitude looks like." The posse turned their horses. They looked at May. Their faces were a mix of confusion, anger, and a new, cold contempt. They saw her as she was an outsider, a traitor. They rode away. May watched them go, their dust cloud rising until it mixed with the haze of the heat. She was alone, with him. Her knees felt weak. She was shaking. She looked down. The man, Koa Blackbird, was unconscious again, but he was alive. She had to move him. She could not leave him here. The sun would kill him, or Tucker would circle back. She dropped the yoke. She grabbed the man under his arms. He was heavier than a sack of grain. He was all dead weight. She pulled. He groaned. She dragged him, backward. Her boots slipped in the dust. It was a terrible, slow journey. Back across the arroyo, up the slight incline, toward the ranch. Every few feet, she had to stop, her lungs burning. The sun beat on her. Her own sweat blinded her. She did not aim for the house. It was too far, and it was too open. The cellar. It was closer. It was built into the side of the mound. Near the barn, she dragged him to the heavy angled door. She fumbled with the wooden bar, her hands raw. She pulled the door open. Dark, cool air rushed out. It smelled of earth and apples. She pulled him. One last heave, over the threshold. He tumbled down the 3 short steps, landing in a heap on the hard-packed dirt floor. May followed, pulling the door shut behind her. The darkness was almost total. The only light came from thin cracks in the door frame. She stood, breathing hard, her eyes adjusting. It was so much cooler. The man was moaning, a low, constant sound. She found her lantern. She struck a match. The small flame flared, casting huge, dancing shadows. She looked at the wound. It was dark, angry. The arrow was deep. She knew from Amos that you did not pull an arrow like that in the field. The broadhead would open an artery. He would bleed out in minutes. The shaft was broken, jagged. She had to clean it. She went to the shelf where she kept her supplies. A bottle of whiskey, saved for snakebite or deep winter. A clean rag, torn from a feed sack. She knelt beside him. She poured the raw, biting alcohol onto the rag. Then she pressed it to the wound, cleaning around the shaft. Koa Blacksbird's body went rigid. His back arched off the floor. A sound was torn from his throat, a guttural cry of pure agony. His eyes flew open. He stared at her. He was awake. He was conscious. The pain had burned through his delirium. His eyes were black, but they were sharp now. They were full of hate and fear and confusion. May held the rag in place. "I am not trying to hurt you," she said, her voice a whisper. "I am trying to help." He stared at her. His chest heaved. He looked at the cellar walls, at the jars of peaches, at the sacks of flour. He was in a trap. He tried to speak. His voice was a dry croak. He said one word, a sound she had never heard. "Nokomi." It was not a curse. It was not a plea. It was just a word, breathed into the darkness of her cellar. May held it. She did not understand it, but she saved it. It felt like a seed, small and hard. She put it away in her mind. Kisk's eyes closed. He passed out again. From the pain or the exhaustion, May sat back on her heels. The cellar was silent, except for his breathing. It was rough, but it was steady. She stood up. She looked at the man lying on her cellar floor. The man Red Tucker called a murderer. The man she had saved. She walked up the steps. She pushed the door open, just a crack, and slipped out, back into the blinding, hostile sunlight. She lowered the door. She dropped the heavy wooden bar back into its cradle. The sound was a dull, final thud. That door was no longer a door. It was a line. She had crossed it. She stood in her yard, her hands stained with his blood. She looked toward the town. She looked toward the empty plains. She was caught. Tucker would be back. He would have the town behind him now. He would have Silas Cobb funding him. He would paint her as a traitor. They would come to take her ranch. And her well. And the others, the Comanche. Tucker was right. They would come. They would be tracking their warrior. They would find his trail. And it would lead here. To her ranch. To her locked cellar. What would they think? Would they see a woman who had offered water? Or would they see a white woman who had taken one of their own and locked him underground? She was standing between 3 fires, the posse, the Comanche, and Silas Cobb. This was not about land anymore. This was not about water. It was about the man breathing in her darkness. One life. and it had just staked the honor and the violence of the entire territory right on her doorstep. The thick cellar door muffled the world. Down in the cool, packed earth, there was no sun, there was no wind, there was only the smell of dust, dried apples, and the faint, metallic tang of blood. May Calloway sat on the bottom step, the lantern at her feet. Its yellow light painted their shadows large and unsteady on the stone walls. Across from her, propped against a sack of flour, was Koa Blackbird. He was awake. He had been awake for hours. The delirium was gone, burned away by the fever or the pain. His eyes were clear, and they were fixed on her. The wildness she had seen in the arroyo, the trapped animal panic, had been replaced by a still, sharp intelligence. He was watching her. He was assessing. She had gone down again with fresh water and more of the whiskey. He had watched her descend the steps, his entire body tensing. He did not trust her. He had no reason to trust her. She had held up the bottle of whiskey. She pointed to his leg. The wound was a dark, angry purple, swollen tight around the broken arrow shaft. It needed cleaning. Again. She did not move toward him. She waited. It was a question. He held her gaze for a long time. The silence stretched. May could hear her own heart beating. Finally. He gave a short, stiff nod. Permission. The second cleaning was worse than the first. He was fully conscious. When the alcohol touched the raw flesh, his body went rigid. His hands clenched into fists, the knuckles white. A low groan vibrated in his chest, but he did not cry out. He clamped his jaw shut. His eyes were squeezed tight, and beads of sweat stood out on his forehead. May worked quickly. Her hands were steady, but she felt the heat radiating from his skin. The fever was high. She finished and pulled the rag away. Koa's body went slack. He was breathing in short, harsh gasps. He opened his eyes. They were exhausted, full of pain, but the suspicion in them had lessened. It was replaced by something else, a flicker of respect. He had seen her apology in her eyes, and he had seen the firmness in her hands. She was not toying with him. She was fighting the infection. May sat back, giving him space. The silence returned, heavy and awkward. She felt the need to fill it, to say something, to make this situation, this man bleeding in her food cellar, seem normal. She looked at him. He was a man, and he was in her cellar. She told him, her voice quiet in the small space, that he had a responsibility. He was not permitted to die down here. His gaze sharpened. She explained she was a practical woman. She had no patience for that kind of mess. The cleanup, she told him, would be a terrible amount of work. He stared at her. The statement hung in the air, absurd and plain. She was not speaking as a white woman to a Comanche. She was speaking as one human being to another, complaining about a future chore. A change happened in his face. The hard line of his mouth, set firm against the pain, wavered. It softened. A small, dry smile touched his lips. It was as thin as a paper cut, and it was gone in an instant. But it had been there. It was like seeing the sun find a single crack in a wall. It was the first true thing that had passed between them. A shared, ridiculous, human moment. He did not speak. He closed his eyes. He was saving his strength. May left him the water dipper and the bucket. She climbed the steps, her own legs feeling weak. She pushed the heavy door open and stepped out into the light, and froze. The world had changed. They were here. It was not the loud, chaotic arrival of Red Tucker and his posse. This was the opposite. It was a vast, terrible silence. They were on horseback, dozens of them. They formed a great, loose circle around her ranch. They sat on their ponies, still as the stones on the mesas. They were at the edge of her cattle pen. They were near the dry arroyo. They were on the low rise to the east. They had enclosed her. There was no sound. No war cries, no shouts, no fires. They just sat, waiting. Their lances and rifles were held upright, dark lines against the morning sky. Their presence was a physical weight. It was the absolute, patient certainty of a jury that had already heard the evidence. They were waiting for the verdict. May's blood ran cold. This was the fear Red Tucker sold in his saloon. But the reality was not a savage, screaming horde. It was this, a disciplined, silent wall of men, a living fence. Her hand gripped her rifle. She forced her feet to move. One step, then another. She walked from the cellar door to her porch. One rider detached himself from the circle. He was not young. He wore a single eagle feather in his hair. His face was a map of hard country and hard decisions. He rode toward her, his pony moving at a slow, deliberate walk. He stopped perhaps 30 yards from her porch. He was Maka Greyhawk. May stood on the top step. She held her rifle, but she kept the barrel pointed at the porch floor. It was not a sign of surrender. It was a sign that the talking had not yet ended. They looked at each other across the dusty yard. Maka Greyhawk spoke. His voice was not a shout. It was deep, and it carried on the dry wind as if it were part of it. He did not ask. He stated they were here for their warrior. May swallowed. She had to force the words out. Her throat was dry. She told him that she had found a man. He was wounded. He was dying. She had saved a human life. Maka Greyhawk's face did not change. He replied. His words were just as simple, just as final. They were here to claim their blood. May felt the trap close, the posse on one side, the Comanche on the other. She had one chance, one appeal. She told him the man was alive. He was in her cellar. He was hurt, but he was alive. Then she made her offer. The man, Koa Blackbird, must choose. Let him speak. When he was able, he could choose to go with them, or he could choose to stay here until his wound was closed. She was gambling. She was gambling on the stories she had heard, the whispers of an honor that was different from the paper laws of Deputy Hart. She was betting her life that these men would not take by force what they could claim by law, their law. Maka Greyhawk was silent. He looked at May. He looked at the heavy, barred cellar door. He looked at the sky. He was considering her. He was measuring her. He knew she was not lying. He knew his warrior was alive and close. He gave his answer. They would wait. He held up his hand, palm out. He turned his horse. He rode, not back to the circle, but to a spot on the rise where he could see both the porch and the cellar. He sat. The circle of riders remained. The siege had not ended, but its nature had changed. It was no longer an execution. It was a vigil. The days passed. It was a new kind of prison. May was an island in a sea of silent observers. She tended her cattle. The warriors watched. She went to her well. They watched. She went to the cellar. They watched. News of her actions had spread to Redemption like a prairie fire. The word was on every lip. Traitor. She had harbored a murderer. She had given water to the enemy. She was no longer the Stone Widow. She was the Comanche widow. The men in Tucker's posse told the story with righteous anger. Silas Cobb listened and smiled his thin, patient smile. The time to buy was getting very close. May felt the isolation like a physical wall. She was cut off. But one evening, she found a package on her doorstep. It was small, wrapped in brown cloth. There was no one in sight. The Comanche circle was dark, silent. She took it inside. She unwrapped it. Dried willow bark, a small pouch of yarrow, a thick root of comfrey. There was no note. It did not need one. This was the hand of Sister Leonie. It was a quiet act, a rebellion of conscience. It was a signal that not every soul in Redemption was owned by Red Tucker. May held the small bundle, and she felt, for the first time in days, that she was not entirely alone. She used the herbs. She went back down to the cellar. Koa's fever was high. She made a poultice. He watched her, his eyes sharp, following the movements of her hands. He had learned her. He knew she was not a threat. He let her work. She took her own handkerchief, one of the last good things she owned from her life before, and dipped it in the water bucket. She wiped the sweat and grime from his forehead. He did not flinch. The cloth came away stained with his sweat, and a smear of bloody mud from his hair. It was a dark, ugly map on the white cotton. May folded it. She put it in her apron pocket. It was a promise. It was a bond. It was an invoice for one human life, not yet paid in full. The truce was fragile. May knew it. Tucker would not stay idle. The next morning, she went to the barn. The air felt wrong. The cattle were nervous, shifting in their pens. The silent eyes of the Comanche riders followed her. She saw the tracks immediately, near the water trough. They were not her boots. They were not the soft moccasins of the watchers. They were heavy, waffle-soled boots, the kind the men in the posse wore. One man. He had come in the deep of night, a ghost moving inside the larger circle of ghosts. Her heart turned cold. She searched. She looked for anything out of place. Her eyes scanned the stalls, the tack. She climbed the ladder to the hayloft. The air was thick with the smell of dry grass. She found it tucked deep inside a bale of the driest hay. It was a bundle of rags, soaked in kerosene. Wrapped around it was a small tin of matches and a strange packet of chemicals she did not recognize. It was an incendiary, a slow burner. It was meant to be set, to smolder, and then to burst into flame hours later, long after the visitor was gone. This was not a crime of passion. This was cold. This was Silas Cobb's arithmetic. This was Red Tucker's hand. They were going to burn her out, burn the barn, the cattle, create chaos. Perhaps the Comanche would be blamed, perhaps in the fire and confusion. They could end this. May dismantled the device, her hands shaking, not with fear, but with a pure, cold rage. She stood at the hayloft door, looking out at the silent circle of men who were her captors, and who, in a strange, terrible way, were also her protectors. They were the only reason Tucker had not ridden in with guns blazing. They were the only reason he was forced to sneak in the dark. She was balanced on the blade of a knife, and the blade was getting sharper. The quiet vigil was broken by the sound of an army. It began as a vibration in the dirt, a low rumble that May felt in her chest before she heard it. Then the sound came, a rolling thunder of hooves, much louder and more numerous than Tucker's first visit. May was at the well. She dropped the bucket. She ran to the edge of the porch, her hands shielding her eyes against the glare. A massive cloud of dust, brown and yellow, was rising to the north. It was the color of anger. It was not just Tucker and his half-dozen men. This was a force. The silent circle of Comanche warriors reacted instantly. They did not retreat. They flowed like water, converging into a tighter, more defensive line between May's ranch and the approaching posse. Their stillness was gone, replaced by the kinetic energy of imminent battle. Lances were lowered, rifles were pulled from scabbards. The posse spilled over the rise. There were at least 30 of them. They were not just Tucker's usual group of saloon idlers. May recognized farmers from down the valley, men who were usually quiet, men who had families. Red Tucker had sold his fear far and wide. He rode at their head, his face set in a mask of righteous fury. But he was not alone at the front. Beside him, looking stiff and miserable in his saddle, was Deputy Hart. The young deputy's face was pale. He held a piece of paper in his hand, letting it flutter in the wind as if to prove it was real. He was the law. And behind them, sitting on a fine horse on the crest of the hill, watching the scene unfold like a man watching a play he had paid for, was Silas Cobb. He was not a fighter. He was a manager. He was here to oversee his investment. The posse stopped 100 yards from the Comanche line. The two groups faced each other, a wall of armed, angry townsfolk, and a wall of silent, ready warriors. And in the middle, on her small porch, was May. She was the fuse. Tucker raised his hand. He did not shout at the Comanche. He shouted at her. "May Calloway," he bellowed, his voice carrying across the dust. By the authority of the New Mexico Territory, I have a warrant for the arrest of the murderer you are harboring, and I have a warrant to search this property for stolen goods." Deputy Hart winced, but held the paper up. It was official. Silas Cobb had bought the law. May's blood ran cold. This was the cleaning Silas wanted. This was how they would burn her out, and do it with a badge to make it clean. Macca Greyhawk moved his horse forward a few steps. He held his hand up, palm facing Tucker. He spoke, not to Tucker, but to May. "The man in the earth, he called. Does he stand?" May understood. Can he fight? She did not know. She turned and ran from the porch to the cellar. She pulled the heavy bar and yanked the door open, plunging into the darkness. Koa was sitting up. He had heard the hooves. He had heard the shouting. His eyes were bright in the dim light. "They are here," May said, breathless. "All of them. With the law. They have a paper." Koa pushed himself farther up the wall. His face was grim. The fever had broken, thanks to the willow bark and May's care, but he was still weak. The arrow remained in his thigh, a permanent, terrible fixture. He looked at the rifle May kept in the cellar, leaning against a barrel of salted pork. The tension outside was a thick, physical thing, a standoff. No one moved, no one fired. They were measuring each other. May returned to the cellar with fresh bandages. The old ones were stiff with dried blood. She knelt beside him. This new silence, this waiting, was worse than the chase. Koa watched her hands as she tore a clean strip from an old bed sheet. He reached out and touched her fingers. He made a shape with his hand. He held it up. 2 fingers, pointed down, moved in a walking motion. "Man," May guessed. He nodded. He then held his hand flat, palm down, and moved it in a smooth, flowing gesture. "Water," he said. His voice was a rasp. He pointed to himself, then to her, then made the sign for water. "You gave water." He then made another sign. He held his fist up, index finger and thumb extended slightly, and moved it in a small circle over his heart. "Peace," or good heart. He was teaching her, in the small, dark, buried room, while 2 armies waited to kill each other over his life. He was teaching her his language. May felt a strange tightening in her throat. She nodded. She pointed to the bandages. "You must fold the cloth," she said, her voice quiet. "Like this. To make a pad, it holds the pressure. It keeps the wound clean." She showed him how to fold the cloth into a thick square. He watched, his dark eyes intense, memorizing the motion. Their heads were close. She could feel the warmth from his skin. It was the first time they had touched this close, without the barrier of pain. Trust was growing, like a seed in the dark. The sun went down. The standoff held. Fires were lit. The posse's fires were large, loud, and numerous, casting a nervous, flickering orange light. The Comanche fires were small, few, and controlled. Just enough to see. Macca Greyhawk had not moved from his spot. Tucker had not moved from his. They were 2 kings on a dry, dusty chessboard. The night grew cold. The desert air lost its heat instantly. A coyote howled, its voice thin and lonely. May was in the cellar. The cold seeped up from the packed earth. She was shivering. Koa was shivering, too. The fever was gone, but the weakness and the cold made him shake. May stood. She climbed the steps and went to the house. The watchers, both Comanche and townsfolk, saw her figure move in the moonlight. She returned to the cellar with a heavy wool blanket, Amos's blanket. She unfolded it. She looked at Koa. He was huddled against the flour sacks. She sat down beside him, on the dirt floor. She did not ask. She simply draped the heavy blanket over her own shoulders, and then, in one smooth motion, stretched it wide, covering him too. They sat side by side, sharing the same small space, the same warmth. Their shoulders touched. She could feel the faint tremor in his muscles. He could hear the steady rhythm of her breathing. It was an intimacy more profound than any touch. It was two people, an enemy and an outcast, finding shelter together in the earth. The air was thick with the scent of wool and dust, and the faint, clean smell of the yarrow she had used on his wound. After a long time, May shifted. Her leg had fallen asleep. She leaned to move, and her shoulder pressed against his. "You are as heavy as a bull," she muttered, the words half lost in the wool. She felt him jolt, a small vibration. She thought it was another shiver, but then she heard it, a low, rough sound from his chest. He was laughing, or trying to. "A bull," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. "Behaves better." A small smile found May's own lips. The fear that had been her constant companion for days, the hard knot in her stomach, loosened. Just for a second. It was a single drop of water on a hot stone. Outside, the tension was breaking. Deputy Hart stood near one of the posse's fires. He was miserable. He was cold, and his conscience was screaming. He had seen the way Tucker looked at May's ranch. This was not law. This was a land grab, painted to look like justice. Red Tucker walked past him, carrying a saddlebag. He moved toward the dark shape of May's barn. Keeping low, Hart followed. He did not know why. He just did. He watched from the shadow of a water trough as Tucker knelt by the barn wall. Tucker opened his bag. In the dim light from the fires, Hart saw what he pulled out. A bundle of oil-soaked rags, a tin of matches, and a dark chemical packet. It was the same device Hart had heard about, the one found in the hayloft. Tucker was not here to arrest anyone. He was here to burn the barn, to create chaos, to flush the savage out, or perhaps just to burn him, and May, alive. The law book in Hart's mind, the one with the clear, simple rules, slammed shut. This was not law. This was arson. This was attempted murder. The badge on his chest suddenly felt heavy and filthy. A man, one of the nervous farmers, was walking patrol. He saw the shadow of Hart move. He saw Tucker kneeling. He saw the dark line of the Comanche warriors in the distance. He panicked. He raised his rifle, aimed at nothing, and fired. The shot was a cannon blast in the silence. The bullet, fired wildly, tore through the night air. It missed the barn. It missed the Comanche. It slammed into the roof of May's small house. Just above the porch, wood splintered. The fragile piece shattered. Instantly, the night exploded. The Comanche line did not break. It moved. Maka Greyhawk shouted an order. His warriors fanned out, taking cover, their own rifles now aimed. The posse erupted in confusion. Men shouted, grabbing their guns. From his vantage point, Silas Cobb cursed. This was messy. In the cellar, May and Koa were thrown apart by the sudden violence. The sound of the bullet striking the house was loud, even underground. May scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering. "They are shooting!" Koa did not panic. He was a warrior. His weakness seemed to fall away, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. He grabbed the Winchester rifle. His hands were sure. He checked the load. He cocked the hammer. He looked at May. "Bar the door," he said. "Not the cellar. The house." May nodded. She ran up the steps, her head low. She burst out into the chaotic, fire-lit night and sprinted for the house, praying she would not be shot. She slammed the heavy oak door of her home. She dropped the thick, wooden bar into its cradle. The house was, for now, a fortress. In town, Sister Leonie was in her small chapel, unable to sleep. She heard the distant, sharp crack of the rifle shot. It was a single, deadly sound in the vast quiet. She knelt. She did not know what else to do. She clasped her hands, and she began to pray. The single, wild shot from the panicked farmer was a punctuation mark. It ended the silence. It began the war. For a moment, there was only the ringing in the air. Then, the posse, strung out, cold, and full in of whiskey and fear, erupted. They thought the shot had come from the Comanche. They thought it was an ambush. A dozen rifles fired at once. The night exploded into a nightmare of noise and chaos. Bullets slammed into the dry earth, sending up plumes of dust. They thudded into the logs of May's small house, splintering the wood. They pinged off the metal hoops of the water barrels. Horses screamed. Men shouted, their voices high and terrified. The line of Comanche warriors did not break. They did not panic. They melted into the shadows, using the rocks and the slight folds of the earth for cover. Their return fire was not a panicked volley. It was measured. It was precise. They were not aiming for bodies. They were aiming for rifles and for the horses. They were warriors, and this was their work. May was in the house. She had just dropped the bar. The walls around her seemed to be coming apart. Wood dust filled the air. A bullet punched through the tin coffee pot on her cold stove, sending it spinning. This was not a fortress. It was a coffin. Koa Blackbird was not in the cellar. He had been moving toward the house, using the cellar door as a shield. When the first shot rang out, he saw the posse's ragged volley. He saw May disappear into the cabin. He knew, with a warrior's certainty, that they would riddle that small building until it fell down. A man from the posse, one of Red Tucker's loyal men, saw Koa. He saw the dark shape moving from the cellar. He saw the rifle. He saw the easy target. He dropped to one knee, taking careful aim. This was not a farmer. This was a killer. May, inside the house, peered through the small window. She saw the man take his aim. She saw he was aiming at Koa. She lifted her own rifle. The one Amos had left her, her hands were not shaking. They were cold. She did not aim to kill. She aimed to protect. She fired. The shot was clean. The bullet struck the man's rifle, not his body. The wooden stock shattered, driving splinters into his hands and face. He screamed, a high, thin sound of pain and shock, dropping the useless, broken weapon. Koa saw the man fall. He saw the puff of smoke from the window. He looked at the house, at the small, dark square where May was. At the same instant, another posse member, drawn by May's shot, spun and fired directly at her window. Koa saw the flash. He saw the man. He saw the window. There was no time to aim, no time to warn. There was only time to act. He launched his body forward. He was wounded. His leg was a ruin. But his desperation gave him a strength he did not know he had. He lunged through the open doorway of the cabin, a dark, heavy shape. He slammed into May. His shoulder hit her chest like a stone. The force of the impact threw both of them backward, away from the window, in a tangle of limbs. They crashed onto the rough plank floor. A bullet ripped through the space where May's head had been. It tore a jagged hole in the wall, showering the floor with debris. May landed hard, her breath knocked out of her. As she fell, her arm scraped violently against the splintered frame of the door. A sharp, burning pain lanced up her forearm. She was alive. He had saved her. Outside, the battle had found its ugly rhythm. Deputy Hart stood frozen by the barn. He had seen Red Tucker strike the match. He had seen the small flame touch the oil-soaked rag. "Tucker, stop! In the name of the law!" Hart shouted, his voice cracking. Red Tucker looked up at him, his face illuminated by the small, growing fire. Tucker's expression was one of pure contempt. "The law is what I say it is, boy," he snarled. "This is how we clean the territory." He pushed the burning rag toward the dry wood of the barn wall. The crack in Deputy Hart's soul finally broke open. The law book, the polished badge, the quiet orders from the county seat. They were all useless paper. The only thing that mattered was the truth, right here, in the dirt. He pulled his pistol. He did not aim at Tucker. He fired it straight up into the dark sky. The shot was a sharp, clear command. "No!" Hart roared, his voice suddenly hard, full of an authority he had never known he possessed. "I said stop. Red Tucker, you are under arrest for attempted arson and conspiracy." The words screamed into the middle of the firefight. were a shock. They cut through the panic. Several of the farmers, the men who had been told this was a legal posse, lowered their rifles. They looked at Hart. They looked at Tucker, who was kneeling by the barn with a fire in his hand. "Arrest Tucker." The power shifted. The posse was not a posse. It was a mob, and its leader was now a criminal. From the hill, Silas Cobb watched his intricate plan burn. Hart had turned. The posse was breaking. The Comanche were not fleeing. His investment was collapsing. A cold, patient rage, the rage of a man who has been denied what he has already paid for, consumed him. He spurred his expensive horse, galloping down the hill. He was screaming, a high, thin sound of fury. Burn it all down," he shrieked. The farmers who had stopped looked at him, their faces slack with confusion. This was Mr. Cobb, the gentleman rancher. Silas did not wait for them. He pulled a torch of his own, pre-made, from his saddle. He lit it. He rode straight to the woodpile stacked against the side of May's cabin. He threw the burning torch onto the tinder-dry wood. The woodpile erupted in flame. A wall of fire shot up, licking at the dry log walls of the house. May, her arm bleeding, scrambled to her feet. She grabbed her rifle. She shoved the door open and stepped out onto the porch, into a world lit by fire and gunfire. She saw Silas Cobb. His face was lit by the flames he had set. His expression was not human. It was the naked, greedy hunger of a wolf. May raised her rifle. She planted her feet. She did not aim at his horse. She aimed directly at the center of his expensive vest. "This is my home, Silas," she shouted. Her voice was not a plea. It was a judgment. It carried over the crackle of the flames. "This is not a line in your account book." Silas Cobb froze. He was a man of paper and contracts. He was not a man of battles. He was staring at his own death, and it was held in the steady hands of the woman he had tried to ruin. The fire changed the fight. The farmers in the posse saw it. They saw the truth. This was not about a murderer. This was not about justice. This was about land. This was about water. This was about theft. One by one, they began to drop their rifles. One man raised his hands high in the air. A young Comanche warrior, his blood hot, saw the man surrender. He saw Koa, his brother, bleeding by the cabin. He raised his lance for a killing strike. "No." Maka Greyhawk's voice cut through the air. He made a sharp, fast hand signal. The warrior froze, his lance trembling. "We do not kill men who have laid down their weapons," Maka declared, his voice ringing with authority. His discipline was absolute. This was not a massacre. This was a defense. The Comanche held their line, but the killing stopped. The posse was broken. It was no longer an army. It was just a crowd of terrified, ashamed men. They began to run, scrambling for their horses, fleeing back up the hill. Red Tucker, exposed, his plan in ruins, turned his rage on Hart. You betrayed me, boy," he growled, raising his rifle. Before he could fire, a single shot came from the Comanche line. It was not a killing shot. It was a judgment. The bullet hit Tucker hard in the shoulder. He screamed, a sound of agony and surprise, and dropped his rifle. He clutched his bleeding arm, stumbled to his horse, and hauled himself into the saddle, retreating in a desperate, wounded gallop. The battle was over, but the fire was not. The flames were climbing the cabin wall. Koa, moving on pure will, limped to the well. He grabbed a bucket. He saw the winch handle was cracked. He did not care. He dropped the bucket, pulled it up, his wounded legs screaming in protest. He threw the water on the base of the flames. May, seeing him, dropped her rifle. She grabbed the other bucket. Two of Maka's men ran forward. They were no longer enemies. They were just men, fighting a fire. They beat the flames with saddle blankets. The fire sputtered. It hissed. It fought back. But the water and the blankets were too much. It died, leaving a black, smoking, ugly scar on the side of the cabin. The night was suddenly, shockingly quiet. The air stank of gunpowder, scorched wood, and the sour smell of fear. The posse was gone. Only a few men remained, their hands in the air, their faces pale. Silas Cobb sat on his fine horse, a man made of stone, defeated. May leaned against the hot, blackened wall of her home. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She looked at her arm. A long, deep tear ran from her elbow to her wrist, the blood dark and thick in the moonlight. Koa stood by the damaged well. He was coated in soot. His leg had finally given out. He was leaning heavily on the well's stone lip, but he was standing. The smoke from the fire was a gray curtain between them. It drifted, swirling in the new silence. May looked at her hand. It was covered in dust, rifle grime, and her own blood. Koa looked at his. It was black with soot from the fire. He took a step toward her, limping heavily. He pushed through the last thin veil of smoke. He stopped in front of her. They were both breathing hard. They did not speak. There were no words for what had just happened. He looked at her bleeding arm. He looked at her face, streaked with soot and sweat. He raised his hand, the hand covered in the black soot of the fire he had fought for her. May looked at it, the hand of a man called a savage, a murderer, the hand of a man who had thrown his body in front of a bullet for her. She lifted her own hand, the hand covered in the gray dust of the land and the red of her own blood. She placed her hand in his. It was not a joining, it was an acknowledgement, a hand of dust and a hand of blood, a hand of fire and a hand of earth. In the silence, surrounded by the wreckage of their fight, they had made their choice. They were, now, one thing. The night bled out, leaving the sky a bruised, sick gray. The smoke still hung in the air, a bitter fog that coated the tongue. The ranch was a tableau of defeat and survival. It was not a battlefield. It was a wreck. The posse members who had not fled sat on the ground, their hands unbound but their spirits broken. They were farmers, not killers. And the sight of Silas Cobb's naked greed and Red Tucker's arson had shattered their borrowed righteousness. Silas Cobb himself had not moved. He sat on his fine horse, a statue of cold fury, his torch now a blackened stick in his hand. He had been a king, and he had been checkmated. Maka Greyhawk and his warriors had not moved. They were a line of silent judges, watching to see what the white man's law would do, now that its true face had been shown. Deputy Hart was the first to move. He walked with a new stiffness. The young, uncertain man who had followed Red Tucker was gone. In his place was a man who had seen the bottom and had decided to climb. He walked past the surrendered men, his face hard. He stopped at Silas Cobb's horse. Silas looked down at him, his eyes dead. Hart's voice was flat. It held no fear. "Silas Cobb," he said, "you are under arrest. You are charged with conspiracy to commit murder, arson, and incitement to riot." Silas sneered. "You have no proof, boy. It is a widow's word against mine, and the word of savages." Hart did not hesitate. He pointed to the hayloft, where the first device had been found. He pointed to the blackened wall of the cabin. Then he pointed at the dozen farmers who were watching, their faces pale in the dawn. "I have them," Hart said, "and I have me. I saw it. Silas, I saw Tucker set the fire at the barn. I saw you throw your torch. I was a coward. I was a fool. But I am a witness." He grabbed the reins of Silas's horse. "Get down!" For a long, terrible moment, Silas Cobb considered his options. He looked at the hard face of the deputy. He looked at the silent, waiting line of Comanche. He looked at May, who stood on her porch, her arm wrapped in a bloody rag, her eyes fixed on him. He dismounted. Hart took his pistol, then bound his hands. He turned to the other men. "You men were lied to, but you still came. You will be escorted back to redemption. You will make your statements to the territorial judge. Your freedom will depend on your honesty." Maka Greyhawk watched this. He saw the paper law, which had been a weapon of theft, finally turn into a tool of justice. He nodded, a single, sharp gesture of acknowledgement. Hart, his prisoner in tow, walked to May's porch. He stood below her, his hat in his hand. He could not meet her eyes. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, his voice thick. "I have no words. I failed my badge. I failed this territory. I failed you. I came here as part of a lie." He took a deep breath. "I will testify. I will tell them everything I saw. The meetings with Cobb, the money, the plan to burn you out, Tucker's boasts. I will see him and Cobb in prison. That is my word." May looked at him. She saw the shame, but she also saw the new resolve. The law was, for a moment, a man, not just a paper. She nodded. Hart turned and began the long, slow march back to town, his prisoners shuffling in the dust ahead of him. The sun was up now. The light was thin and yellow. The aftermath was quiet. Mucka Greyhawk walked his horse toward the porch. He stopped a few yards away. He looked at the bullet holes. He looked at the burned wall. "Your people will not forgive this," he said, his voice blunt. "That deputy is one man. The town is a nest. They will say you sided with us against them. They will say you harbored a murderer. They will find a new way to take this land. Your home is a scar. You cannot stay." He paused. A formal invitation. "This place is dead for you. Come with us. We honor those who protect our blood." May did not answer. She looked at her ranch, her home, the grave of her husband, the well, now damaged. The word traitor was already settling on the roof like a vulture. Mecca was right. This was not her home anymore. She turned and went inside the smoky cabin. Koa was there, leaning against the wall, his face pale. The energy that had carried him through the fight was gone. He was just a man, badly wounded, his leg stiff and swollen. Her own arm throbbed, a deep, fiery ache. The adrenaline was gone, and the pain was taking its place. They were a pair of broken soldiers. They needed to tend to the wounds. The immediate danger was past. The physical one was here. May looked at her water barrel. It was empty. She went to the well. The winch was splintered from a stray bullet. The rope was frayed. She lowered the bucket. It scraped the bottom. She pulled it up. It was barely half full, and the water was cloudy with soot and mud from the fight. It was the last of her water. The well, her anchor, was dying. She carried the bucket inside. Koa sat on the stool, his hands caked in black grime from the fire. May took a dipper of the precious, dirty water. She knelt in front of him. She poured it over his hands, using her one good hand to wash away the soot. It was a baptism. The first time. She had given him clean water to save his life, an act of pure grace. This time, she gave him the last of her muddy water to clean away the battle, an act of shared survival. The circle was closing. She found Sister Leonie's herbs. She found the last of her clean bandages. She looked at Koa's leg. The arrow shaft was still there, dark and menacing. It had to come out, but she did not have the skill. She cleaned the wound as best she could. She made a poultice of the willow bark and laid it around the angry flesh. Her touch was gentle. He watched her hands, his eyes following her movements. When she was done, she sat back, exhausted, and held up her own bleeding arm. He took a strip of cloth. His movements were slow, careful. He examined the long, ragged tear. He poured a little of the whiskey she had left, the same bottle she had used on him, onto a rag. He cleaned the wound. May hissed. The sting was sharp. He did not stop. His touch was firm, precise. He wrapped the bandage tightly, securing it with a knot. They sat in the smoky room, side by side, leaning against the wall. Their shoulders touched. They did not speak. The cabin was quiet, save for the sound of their breathing. The closeness was not passion. It was care. It was the deep, silent understanding of two people who had bled together. A new sound came from outside, a single mule. May stood, her rifle in her hand. Koa pushed himself up, wincing. A woman's voice called out, "May, it is Leonie." May lowered the rifle. Sister Leonie appeared in the doorway, her small, worn medical bag in her hand. She looked at the devastation, her face etched with sorrow. "I heard the shot last night," she said. "I prayed. Then I packed my bag. It seemed more practical." She came inside. She looked at May's arm. She nodded at Koa's handiwork. A good, tight wrap. She knelt by Koa, examining his leg. Her face was grim. "This arrow is deep. It must be removed, but not by me, not here. It has missed the bone. I think that is a miracle, but it needs a true surgeon. Or," she looked at Koa, "your own medicine men." She gave Koa a draft for the pain. She gave May a small bottle of laudanum. May looked at the small, brave woman. "What will happen in town?" she asked. Sister Leonie sighed. She packed her bag. She stood. "People's talk is short, May, but their memory for hate is long. They will call you a traitor. Red Tucker will paint himself as a martyr. Silas Cobb has money. This is not over." She put her hand on May's good arm. "The road, however, is longer than their talk. You must choose the road. God be with you." She turned and left, a small, gray figure of decency, riding back to a town that had lost its own. The sun was starting to dip now, filling the high plains with a thick, golden light. The day was ending. Macca Greyhawk and his warriors were preparing to move. Horses were being gathered. May and Koa stood outside the cabin. The air was cool, the wind soft. It was over. Koa faced her. He was standing, though his weight was all on his good leg. He reached up to the thin leather cord around his own neck. He pulled it off. On the cord was a single, polished piece of bone, smooth as riverstone, and a dark red rock, the color of dried blood. It was an amulet. He did not ask. He did not speak of love or of the future. He simply lifted the cord. He placed it over May's head. The amulet settled against her collarbone. The stone was cool from the air, and then, almost instantly, it was warm against her skin. It was a promise. It was a shield. It was a mark of belonging. "You are protected." May touched the stone. She looked up at him. Her face was streaked with soot. Her dress was torn. Her arm was bound in a crude bandage. She saw her reflection in his dark eyes. She was a ruin. A small, dry smile touched her lips. It was the humor of the gallows, the humor of the survivor. Her voice was rough. "Well," she said, "I guess I am not much of a lady." She looked down at the bloodstone. "I ain't no lady." Koa looked at her. He saw the woman who had knelt in the arroyo, her hand steady. He saw the woman who had held a rifle to Silas Cobb, her voice a judgment. He saw the woman who had washed his hands in the last of her water. A slow, real smile transformed his face. It was not the thin grimace of pain or the dry smile of their shared joke in the cellar. This was real. It reached his eyes. He gave a low, soft laugh, a sound from deep in his chest. "Good," he said. His voice was low, and it held a warmth that was new. "That is what I came for. Darlin." The word was not a familiarity. It was a coronation. He was not looking for a fragile thing to save. He had found an equal. A call from Macca broke the moment. It was time to ride. May turned. She looked at the cabin, the bullet holes, the charred wood, the sagging porch. She looked at the small, mounded grave of her husband, Amos, near the dry creek bed. That life was over. The stone widow was gone. She walked to the cabin door. She did not go inside. She pulled the heavy, splintered door shut. She reached for the wooden bar, the one she had dropped into place against Tucker. Against the world. She lifted it. She settled it into its cradle. The sound was a dull, final thud. She was not locking the world out. She was locking her old life in. She turned her back on the house. She did not look back. Koa was waiting. Macca's men had brought her a horse. She walked toward it, her head high, the red stone warm against her chest, and did not look back. The horse provided for May Calloway was a gray mare, steady and calm, with none of the nervous energy of the posse's animals. May put her foot in the stirrup and pulled herself up. A sharp, white-hot pain shot up her bandaged arm, and she gasped, but she did not stop. She settled into the saddle. It was a man's saddle, worn, deep, and secure. Koa was already mounted. It had taken 2 men to help him up. His face was a pale, tight mask of controlled agony. The arrow was still in his leg. He could not bend his knee. He sat stiffly, his rifle resting across his lap. Maka Greyhawk sat at the head of the column, watching the sun clear the eastern mesas. He looked at May. He looked at Koa. He gave a single, short command. The group moved. It was not a chaotic rabble. It was a flowing, silent entity. Over 50 people, men, women, and children. Horses and pack mules, moving as one. They slipped away from the scarred ranch, the sound of their hooves muffled by the dust. May did not look back at the bullet holes or the charred wall. She did not look at the broken well. She kept her eyes forward, but she turned her head for one brief second to the small, mounded grave of her husband, Amos, a silent farewell. The wind picked up, as if to answer, blowing her hair loose from its knot. They left the basin. They left the flat, cracked land of the drought. They rode into the high country, following a path May had never known existed. It was a thin game trail, winding up into the red rock canyons. The air grew thinner, cooler. It smelled of pine resin and juniper, a clean, sharp scent that scoured the smoke and fear from her lungs. It smelled of the sweat of her horse, a warm, living smell. The pace was slow. It was dictated by Koa's wound and by the women and children in the column. This was not a flight. It was an exodus. That night, the sky was a deep, sharp purple, and the moon was a sliver, a knife blade of cold light. May looked up at it. The stars were bright, hard points, not the hazy, dusty stars of the ranch. Below, the canyons and valleys fell away in deep shadow, like the veins on the back of a giant, sleeping hand. A hawk cried, high above, a sound of pure, unburdened freedom. May felt her shoulders, which had been tight for 2 years, begin to unlock. They made camp in a sheltered cove, protected by high walls of sandstone. The Comanche did not light a large, single fire. They built 3 small, smokeless fires, using dry wood. May sat apart. She was the outsider, the white woman, the Darlin of the warrior, but not one of them. She felt the eyes of the other women on her. They were not hostile. They were curious. They were measuring her, just as Maka had. Koa was immediately taken to a lodge set apart from the others. A man with gray hair, his face lined with authority, went in after him. The medicine man. They were going to take the arrow out. May wanted to follow, but she knew this was not her place. She sat alone, her wrapped arm aching, and waited. An older woman, her hair in 2 thick, gray braids, came to her. She did not speak. She held out her hand. In her palm was a small, dense cake of blue corn. May looked at the offering. It was food. It was communion. She took it. "Thank you," she said. The woman nodded. She sat near May, but not too close. They ate in silence. The corn cake was rough, smoky, and deeply satisfying. It was the best thing May had tasted in years. Later, the woman returned. She carried a bone comb. She gestanone to May's hair, which was a tangled mess from the fight and the long ride. May hesitated. It was an intimate thing. The woman gestured again, more firmly. May sat on the ground, and the woman knelt behind her. May felt the comb begin to work at the knots. Slowly, patiently. The woman's hands were strong and surprisingly gentle. She worked the tangles out, one by one. Then she began to braid. It was not the simple 3-strand braid May knew. It was a tighter, more complex weave. The woman's fingers moved with a rapid, sure knowledge. When she was finished, she tucked the end of the braid securely. May reached up and touched it. It was solid, heavy, and tight. It would not come loose in the wind. The woman had given her a gift. She had, without a single word, begun to weave her into the fabric of the people. Koa did not return to the fire. May lay down on the blanket they gave her, her saddle for a pillow, and stared at the stars, the stone amulet warm against her skin. She slept, for the first time in many nights, without a rifle in her hand. The next day, she saw him. He was sitting in the sun outside the medicine lodge. The arrow was gone. His leg was wrapped in a thick poultice of herbs. He was pale, and he leaned on a carved stick, but his eyes were clear. The poison was leaving him. He motioned for her to sit. She did not ask about the pain. He would not speak of it. She asked the question that had been burning in her. "That man," she said, her voice low, "the Henderson boy? Tucker said you—" Koa looked away, toward the high canyon walls. He was silent for a long time. "Tucker's world," he said finally, his voice rough, "is made of taking. He takes land, he takes fear, he takes lives." He touched his own chest. "My honor, our honor, is about staying. It is about keeping. We do not fight for land. The land is not ours to own. We fight for our families. We fight to keep them whole." He told her about the raids, not raids by them, but raids on them. The soldiers, the posses, like Tucker's, paid to clean the territory. He told her of families scattered, of children taken, of women left with nothing. "My work," he said, "is to be the shield, to stand between the takers and the people." The Henderson boy. He was with Tucker's men. They cornered one of our women, a girl, by the dry creek. They were not talking. They were taking. He looked at his hands. "We fought. He died. It was not a murder. It was a consequence. Tucker calls me a savage, but he is the one who hunts for heads. I hunt for heartbeats. My honor is to keep our people here, to keep them living." May understood. The world was not black and white. Us and them. It was shades of gray. Tucker was not law. He was a predator. Koa was not a savage. He was a protector. The journey continued. They moved for 3 more days, deeper into the high rock. On the 4th day, Mecca held up his hand. The column stopped. Ahead, in a narrow pass, 2 men were checking traps. White men, trappers. The warriors fanned out, their rifles appearing as if by magic. The 2 trappers saw them. Their hands flew to their own guns. They were terrified. It was the Callaway Ranch all over again, a small spark, ready to explode. May watched. This was the moment. This was the test. She nuded her horse forward. Maka watched her, but he did not stop her. She rode into the open space between the 2 groups. She held up her one good hand, palm out, just as she had seen Maka do. "We are not here for a fight," she called out. Her voice was steady. It did not tremble. The trappers looked at her, their eyes wide, a white woman. "With them." "We need salt," May said. "We do not have charity," one of the trappers shouted, his rifle still aimed. "We are not asking for charity," May said, her voice hard. "We are here to trade." The trappers looked confused. "Trade?" May pointed to her own tightly wrapped arm. "I can mend. I have a good, strong stitch. I see that tear in your coat. I can make it new." She then pointed to Koa, who had moved his horse up. Just behind her. "My friend, he knows this country. He knows where the beaver have moved. Now that the streams are low, he can give you a true map. Skills for salt." The trappers looked at each other. They looked at the line of warriors. They looked at this strange, hard woman with the perfect braid. This was not a raid. This was business. One of them lowered his rifle. "We have salt," he said. "Show us." For an hour, May sat by a rock, her needle and thread moving with precision, closing the tear in the heavy canvas coat. Koa, with a piece of charcoal, drew a map on a flat stone, showing the trappers a new, hidden valley. The trade was made, a heavy bag of salt, no shots fired. As they rode away, May felt a new sense of place. She was not a prisoner. She was not a victim. She was a bridge. She was the living border. That evening, the sky turned a dark, bruised purple. The air was heavy. Still, a storm was coming. They were moving through a wide, dry arroyo, the high walls rising on either side. The rain began as a few fat drops. Then the sky tore open. It was not the gentle, life-giving rain May had prayed for on her ranch. It was a violent, hard, angry flood. The dry, baked earth could not drink it. The water sheeted off the rocks, turning the dry arroyo into a roaring, muddy river in seconds. Maka bellowed, to high ground. Now! The column scrambled, horses slipping and sliding on the slick rock, trying to climb the canyon walls. May's mare panicked. It slipped. The brown, churning water, already knee-deep, slammed into them. The horse lost its footing. May was thrown from the saddle, into the freezing, powerful current. She hit the water. It stole her breath. It was full of sand and debris. It was pulling her down, tumbling her. A hand grabbed the collar of her dress. Koa, he was on a narrow ledge, just above the waterline. He had thrown himself from his horse, his bad leg forgotten. He had her. He pulled. His face was a mask of terrible effort. His feet slipped on the wet stone. He was using only his arms, his upper body. He grunted, a low, animal sound of pure will. May clawed at the rock, her one good hand finding a hold. He pulled again. He hauled her up, out of the roaring water. She collapsed onto the ledge, spitting out muddy water, shaking, her body a single, cold nerve. They were soaked. The rain was still pounding down. The flood roared past them, a brown, angry monster. Koa leaned back against the canyon wall, his eyes closed, his chest heaving. His bad leg was trembling violently. May, shivering, looked at him. They were alive. They were safe. The rain began to slow. The tension of the moment passed. May looked at the roaring water. She looked at Koa, who was wincing in the cold, his face pale. She had to say something. The silence was too heavy. "If you had slipped," she said, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely speak, "I could not have held you. I think I would have only caught your shadow." Kadoa opened his eyes. He looked at her. Her face was streaked with mud. Her hair was coming loose from the tight braid. He did not smile. He just looked at her, his gaze steady, full of a warmth that defied the cold rain. "My shadow," he said, his voice low and rough. "It belongs to your fire." They sat there, side by side, sharing the cold, their shoulders pressed together, a small island of warmth in the storm. The flood receded as quickly as it had come. The camp that night was wet, cold, and miserable. The small fire sputtered, smoking in the damp air. May sat by one of the fires, drying her hair. Mecca Greyhawk came and sat near her. He stared into the smoky flames. "Peace," he said, as if continuing a conversation they had never started. "Peace is a daily job." May looked at him. "War is easy." He continued, "A moment of fire. It is fast. It is clean. Peace is harder. It is slow. You must build it. You must mend it. You must wake up every day and do the work of peace." He nodded toward the center of the camp, where an old man was gathering the children. "Tonight," he said, "the elders will tell the stories. It is how we remember who we are. It is how we learn, again, how to do the work." May watched the children gather. She felt the warmth of the fire. She was cold. She was sore. Her arm ached, but she was not afraid. She was, for the first time in her life, exactly where she was supposed to be. The journey had not been easy. Koa's leg, freed from the arrow by the patient, painful work of the medicine man, had begun to heal. The deep, hot poison was gone. Leaving a clean ache, they traveled for another week, moving south, away from the high rock canyons and toward the lands where the people wintered. The path took them through one final, necessary pass, a narrow channel of gray stone that acted as a gateway to the high plains. Maka Greyhawk, at the head of the column, held up his hand. The entire line of riders stopped. The pass was blocked. Red Tucker was there. His shoulder was heavily bandaged, his arm in a sling, but he was standing, and beside him, his fine suit now rumpled and stained, was Silas Cobb. They were not alone. They had 4 men with them, hard men May did not recognize, men who held their rifles with a casual familiarity. Tucker unrolled a piece of paper. He held it up, a white flag of false authority. "This is as far as you go," Tucker bellowed, his voice echoing off the stone walls. He was not speaking to Maka. He was speaking to May. "I have a federal warrant for the seizure of the Calloway property for non-payment of taxes, and a warrant for your arrest, Mistress Calloway, as an accomplice to murder and a traitor to the territory." Silas Cobb smiled. It was his old, thin smile, full of patience and victory. He had bought one last piece of paper. Koa moved his horse beside May's. His hand rested on his rifle. The warriors behind them fanned out, their movements silent, closing the mouth of the pass.
"This is a lie,"
May said, her voice clear. "Of course it is," a new voice said. From behind a high boulder, Deputy Hart stepped out. His badge was polished. He was not alone. Beside him stood Sister Leonie, her hands clasped in front of her. And behind them were the 2 farmers, the men who had been part of the posse, their faces now hard with shame and resolve. Hart looked at Tucker, and there was no fear left in his eyes, only a cold, tired certainty. "We rode to the county seat. Red," Hart said, his voice loud. "We spoke to the territorial judge. We told him everything. He said there is no warrant for Mistress Calloway. He said the deed to her ranch is clear. The only warrants he issued, he said, are for you and for Mr. Cobb." Tucker's face went white. He looked at Silas. Silas's smile was gone. "It is over," Hart said. Tucker was a cornered animal. His one good hand fumbled for his pistol. He roared, a sound of pure rage, that no paper pusher was going to take him. Before he could draw, before a warrior could notch an arrow, Hart fired his own pistol. The shot was not aimed at Tucker. It was aimed at the sky, a single, loud, final warning. "Put it down, Red," Hart commanded. The 4 hired men looked at Tucker. They looked at Hart and his witnesses. They looked at the 50 silent Comanche warriors who had them boxed in. This was not a fight. This was a trap. One by one, they lowered their rifles. They put their hands in the air. Silas Cobb saw it. He saw everything, his land, his water, his power, dissolving into the dust of a canyon. He saw May Calloway sitting on her horse watching him. She was not a victim. She was a judge. He made a sound, a high, thin whine of disbelief. He turned to run, to scramble back up the rocks. His fine, expensive boots were not made for this country. His foot slipped on the loose shale. He fell hard. The sound was not loud. It was a wet, heavy crack. Silas screamed. It was not a roar of rage. It was a shriek of pain. He clutched his leg, his body twisting on the ground. He had fallen, and in his fall, his own weight had snapped his ankle. His greed had finally, truly, crippled him. Hart holstered his pistol. He walked forward, his handcuffs dangling from his hand. He stepped over the moaning Silas and went straight to Tucker. He put the cuffs on Tucker's one good wrist, and then attached the other to his belt. "It is done," he said. Maka Greyhawk watched the entire scene, his face impassive. He saw the law, which had been a whip, become a tool. He gave a single nod. He would not interfere. This was the white man's justice, and it was, for once, complete. Hart walked back to the weeping, broken Silas. He bound his hands. He looked up at May. "We will take them back, Mistress Calloway. They will stand trial. A real trial. I promise you that." Sister Leonie stepped forward. She looked up at May, and her eyes were bright. "Justice. May," she said, "sometimes it is not a storm. Sometimes it is just a clear voice, in the right place, at the right time." Hart and his small group, with their prisoners, moved aside, letting the column pass. They did not ride far. They made camp on the high mesa, overlooking the vast plains. The air was cool. May knew she had one last thing to do. She spoke to Hart, and she spoke to Sister Leonie. "The ranch," she said, "the building is damaged, but the land is still there. My husband's grave is there." "It is yours," Hart said. "The judge was very clear. Your title is perfect." May looked at Koa. He was watching her. He knew what she was going to do, before she did. "There is a family," May said. "The Petersons. They are Swedish. They lost their homestead near the dry river. They have 3 small children. I want you to draw up a paper for me, Mr. Hart." Hart looked confused. "What kind of paper?" "I am giving them the ranch," May said. Sister Leonie's hands flew to her mouth. "May," she whispered. "I am not selling it," May continued, her voice firm. "I am giving it to them for the price of $1. She held up her hand. "On 2 conditions. The first is that the well is for everyone. They will tend it, and they will share the water with anyone who asks, no matter their skin. The second is that they will tend my husband's grave." Hart looked at her, his respect a raw, new thing on his face. "I will draw it up," he said. "I will see it filed myself. It is a good future for that land." May nodded. She looked at Koa, at Maka, at the women who had taught her to braid her hair. She was not leaving her people. She was not a traitor. She was simply, finally, going home. She was going to the people who respected her freedom, to the man who saw her as she was. That evening, as Hart and Leonie prepared to take their prisoners back to redemption, May stood alone on the edge of the mesa. The sky was a heavy, gray ceiling. The air was still. She reached into the neck of her dress. She pulled out the small, leather cord she had worn for years. On it was a chum of keys. The key to her house, the key to her pantry, the key to the cellar, the heavy iron keys to a life that was finished. She held them in her hand. They were cold. They were a weight. She saw a high, flat stone, a natural altar at the edge of the world. She walked to it. She looked at the keys one last time. Then she opened her hand. She laid them on the stone. She did not throw them. She placed them, a deliberate act of release. She turned away. Her hand went to her throat, to the leather cord Koa had given her. She closed her fingers around the smooth, cool bone and the dark, red stone. This was the only key she needed now. As her hand touched the amulet, the air changed. A single, cold drop of water hit her face. She looked up. Another. A fine, soft mist began to fall. It was not the angry, violent flood of the canyon. It was not the dry, empty wind of the drought. It was a real, gentle, cleansing rain. It fell on her face, on her hair. It fell on the dry plains, turning the dust dark. A single, perfect drop of water landed on the red stone at her throat. It clung there, a small, shining jewel. The drought was broken. The circle was closed. The act of grace, that first dipper of water she had given a dying man, had been returned to her, 1,000-fold, from the sky. Koa moved to stand beside her. He did not touch her. He just stood, his shoulder almost brushing hers. His leg was healing. He was straight and strong. They did not speak. They did not need to. They stood together in the soft, falling rain and watched the world turn clean. They looked at each other. His eyes were full of a quiet, steady truth. Her eyes were full of peace. The silence between them was not empty. It was full. It held everything. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to hear where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and connect with other listeners. If you enjoyed our tale, please subscribe to Wild West Night, like this video, and give it a boost by pressing the hype button so more people can discover this story.